So welcome. I'd like to welcome everyone. Good morning, or for a few of us, good evening. It is a pleasure to be here today with fellow members of the Pacific region to ensure greater protection of our coral reefs through the CBD post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on whose lands we are all meeting today and their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to thank Vulcan for their sponsorship of this event. And I would also like to thank the conference hosts, SPREP, the Pacific Island Roundtable for Nature Conservation and New Caledonia. As Australia's focal point for the International Coral Reef Initiative, known fondly as ICRI, and as current ICRI Secretariat Co-Chair alongside Indonesia and Monaco, I've witnessed the evolution of this important work. In December 2018, at the ICRI General Meeting in Monaco, members concluded that there is an urgent and continued need for action to address the threats facing coral reefs in the new CBD framework. Since this time, ICRI has been working through its ad hoc committee to develop a recommendation that urges CBD parties to prioritise coral reefs in the framework, and particularly with the explicit inclusion of clear, specific and actionable coral reef indicators. This recommendation was adopted by members of the last ICRI General Meeting here on the Great Barrier Reef, and has since been used by members to present strong and coherent voice from 70% of the world's coral reef nations on the importance of conserving these precious ecosystems. In an important step, the IUCN recently passed a motion to conserve and protect coral reefs through the post-2020 framework, prioritising the integrity and functioning of coral reefs. The success of this motion is due, in a small part, to ICRI's leadership on this issue. As you are all keenly aware, coral reefs, it is a crucial time for coral reefs. And with the new CBD framework, we have an opportunity to ensure coherent global action on coral reefs to help prevent their further decline and safeguard them into the future. Thank you all for all of your important work thus far, and I wish this a productive and beneficial event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret, for opening our session today. And hello, everybody. My name's Emily Corcoran, and I'm working with the International Coral Reef Initiative on the issue of how to prioritise coral reefs in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and have done so for the last couple of years. And we'll be talking you through some of this session. So just a couple of housekeeping things to start with. You would have seen that you have the option to listen to this session in either French or English. So please don't forget to select your language channel. And you can also ask us questions. So please submit your questions through the Q&A button. We look forward to being able to take those later on in the session during the panel element. We will also be asking you some questions. And perhaps, Luke, you can share the first two polls. We're keen to find out a little bit about what your thoughts are. So you'll see these as we get started. The first questions are about what you think threats are to coral reefs, and also what kind of status you think coral reefs are in. And next, we're going to be hearing from Serge Plein, who is going to actually tell us a little bit more about some of these things and provide us with some context before we go on to talk about the ICRI recommendation, what that means, and then go to our panelists that will be moderated by Anne-Claire Garand, and she will introduce our panelists and have a discussion about what this means for the region. So that's the first of the panel, first of the poll questions. And if we could just flash up the second one, perhaps. You have to answer quickly. These are short fire questions. And then Serge, I will share your slides from my screen and just let me know as you want me to advance.
Serge, you just need to make sure you're unmuted there,
Yep.
Serge.
Yes, I'm unmuted now. I'm just saying this is not the first slide.
Oh, sorry. That's
this is not the last one.
the spoiler.
Yeah, now it's good.
Oh, no.
Not that one.
No, not that either. No, it's the late hour of the evening, and oh, not that one. Sorry, Serge, I'm pressing all the wrong buttons. Here we go. This should be it.
It is good. So I first would like to thank the committee for inviting me, and then I'll be trying to sort of give a sort of an overview of the state of coral reef in the Pacific from the actual knowledge that we have. This is based basically on a recent report we did about 2 years ago, and as well as on a report that we're doing also in the context of the JCRMN recently at the worldwide level, but also looking at local and regional changes. Next one, please. So when talking about, next one, please. When talking about the Pacific, we're talking about an area of coral reef that is about 70,000 square kilometers, and that's about almost 27% of the world coral reefs. So that's a quarter of the coral reef. That's 16 countries, 13.5 million, very different sort of gross domestic product between the different countries, from very high to very low, I would say. And in some cases, the food resources that provide coral reef, it's 100% of dietary protein. So really, in some countries, actually, the coral reef are providing really what is the only sources of food in terms of food. And of course, those reefs are also have a threat. Probably one of the most obvious one is bleaching. And a few other ones are sort of varying according to location, according to countries, going from overfishing, acanthaster outbreak, sewage treatment, erosion due to agriculture development, and sort of driving all the sediments into the reef. Next one, please. When talking about the state of the reef, what I want to talk is about what we did already in the context of the JCRMN. That is the regional report that was published 2 years ago. That is based on while the Pacific is very large, and while the Pacific has a lot of coral reef, well, there's not so high number of people working really in the Pacific and sort of monitoring what's happening and what's going on in terms of coral reef. And there's only, and you can see out of the 25,000 islands that you can find in the Pacific, there's only 128, but would say 130 for which we have data, and that's about 19 territories for which we have data. So it's a small amount of representation, but it's still it's 9,000 survey. It's something like around 500,000 records of state of coral reef that we have in the Pacific. Next, please. So this is and I'll go straight to the main result. So we follow the coral reef through one parameter, one driver, that is the hard coral cover, which is basically the percentage of a coral cover that is occupied by live coral. So it's a percentage of the substrate that is occupied by coral. And you can see that in the Pacific, there is an average around 25%. This means that on a square meter, there's about a quarter that is occupied on average by coral reef. Live coral, and you can see that through the 25 at least the last 25 years, it's been fairly stable, and you can see that there's only a slight decrease really that is appearing on the left diagram that shows a slight decrease on the last 10 years. You can see that on the right diagram that actually the decrease is actually increasing, and this is that graph. It comes from the recent analysis that we are on the way right now about the evolution of coral reef in the world, and this is for the Pacific. You can see that this decrease is actually increasing on the last 5 years. Next one, please. While the coral reef are changing and decreasing slightly, there is also a difference according to the taxa. And you can see that Prioritis, Pocillopora are not changing much. They're low and they're still low, but Prioritis actually are increasing. So there is not only a change in the decrease in the coral cover, there's also a change in the taxa, in the coral species that are making the coral reef. And that change actually goes into a less diverse coral reef, which will become slowly dominated by one taxa that is made by the Prioritising, what we call the massive coral, while all the branching coral, Acropora, Parsolepora, are actually going down. And so there's a clear change in the visual structure of the coral reef that you can see, and that it's happening especially on the last, I would say, 10, 15 years. Next one, please. But this is not the end of the world. And I want to insist that, and that's an example, and there's many examples in the Pacific of that. This is actually the oldest example that we have. You have a monitoring of 40 years of coral reef, and you can see the same parameters, which is the hard coral, the percentage of live coral on the substratum. And you can see that over the last 40 years, there's been major break that are the consequence of cyclones, of ice breaks, of bleaching, of cyclone again. But each time the coral reef is actually bouncing and is capable of coming back. That capacity of coming back, that capacity of recovery, it's something that to me that is going to be the most important to keep, to make sure that each time we're going through a decreasing size situation, we have the capacity and we maintain the capacity of the coral reef to actually recover from its previous situation. Next one, please. So if I want to give a sort of a take-home message, is that right now there is no dramatic global decline in the Pacific for coral, and coral in the sense of taken by its main proxy, that is the live coral cover percentage. But there is clearly a sign for the last 10, 15 years that there is a slight decline, and that decline is slowly increasing. So we are on a fragile equilibrium right now, and that equilibrium is in the bad shape right now, and it is really time to work on that. What is clear is that also we have a change in the diversity. We have a change in the taxa that are making the coral reef, and the coral reef that we have now actually are going to be changed. And also what is important to show is that there is a capacity of coral reef to recover if we put them in the situation where they can recover. And that's going to be the challenge for the future, is to maintain the habitat, it's to maintain the condition of the coral reef, around the coral reef, in terms of erosion, in terms of coastal development, in terms of sewage treatment, all those aspects that have direct impact on the coral reef. We have to work primarily on those ones right now to stop the actual decrease that we're seeing. And this, because clearly the loss of diversity will lead to loss in the socio-ecosystem benefit that we can have. And clearly a reef that has a diversity of coral will also have a diversity of fish, will have also a diversity of benefits that we can think about, which can be a tourism, which can be any kind of use of the coral reef that you can find. And so what I want to emphasize is that this is not dramatic right now in the Pacific, but it is starting to go into the wrong direction. And so it is really time right now to make some decision about at least the coastal management and all what is land, coral, I would say land sea use, and then to go and stop what the climate change is doing, because bleaching is really one of the key parameters those days in the Pacific. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Serge, very much as well for setting the scene for us and for taking us through how things are looking in the Pacific. I'll just stop sharing a second, and perhaps, I don't know, Luke, if there was any feedback from those polls that we were asking.
Yeah, sure. So I've put the results there in the chat. So there was the first question was, what do you see as the top threat facing coral reefs? The largest answer of 60% was climate change, and then the rest were quite spread out across pollution, tourism, fishing, and coastal development.
Yeah, and then with the status of coral reefs in the Pacific, 92% saying fair. So
no, that's 92%.
No?
Sorry, my mistake. Yes, you're right, 92% fair.
8% saying poor. So kind of reflects what you were saying, I guess, Serge, that things aren't great.
That's pretty unusual. I wouldn't expect that actually people would have thought that, but that's yeah, that's a bit what it is. Except I'm saying that we're going into the wrong direction on the recent sort of last 10 years, I would say.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your presentation, and that leads us into a presentation now that I will share with you about the ICRI recommendation and the work that we've been doing there in order to try and make sure coral reefs remain a priority in global policy to ensure that actions that Serge was referring to can be taken. So I will start my presentation by just introducing very briefly the International Coral Reef Initiative. This is a global partnership between nations and organizations working together to strive to preserve the world's coral reefs and their related ecosystems. The ICRI Secretariat, as Margaret said at the beginning, is hosted by, for a certain period by governments and is currently hosted by the governments of Australia, Indonesia, and Monaco. One of the key roles of the ICRI partnership is to develop coordination and consensus building in relevant policy areas. In the countries that are members to ICRI, there are 44 countries that are members to ICRI, and they represent 75%, that's 3/4 of the world's coral reefs, and almost all of them are party to the Convention on Biological Diversity, which will be the focus for our conversation this morning. If you'd like to find out more about ICRI, then you can please visit the website or pop into our booth. If you haven't done already, given it's the last day, it's your last chance. And you can also contact my colleague Francis Staub as well. The other piece of this puzzle that we're talking about is the Convention on Biological Diversity's post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Now, you may or may not be familiar with this process, but it's been a couple of years and a highly consultative process to try and set an ambition to agree a new transformative framework that will shift the way that the world looks at and uses and protects nature. The framework will build on the previous experience in the last 10-year strategy and the HE targets, which recognize that as a result of the last 10 years, it's been recognized that we need to do things a bit differently, that we need to think of different ways of approaching the problems if we're to achieve the CBD's vision of living in harmony with nature by 2050, excuse me. This need to do things differently was made really clear when the Global Biodiversity Outlook was published. This was an assessment of these HE targets to look at how we've done over the past 10 years. And one of the really stark findings was that none of the HE targets were achieved. And perhaps HE target 10, which is the target that looks particularly at coral reefs, was the worst performing. It's notable that this target, HE target 10, also really struggled with measurability and the lack of meaningful and useful indicators that could help us measure whether there was progress or not. And this, as you can see on the screen, led to a conclusion that either the status of coral reefs were moving away from the target, things were getting worse, or actually it's unknown, it couldn't be measured. And so one of the things that has been learned is that there's a real need to strengthen our ability to detect change and help us increase accountability, learning and communication of targets and goals under the new framework. Something else that was highlighted not only by the Global Biodiversity Outlook, but also WWF's Living Planet report, is that corals are showing the most rapid increase in an extinction risk of all the groups that they assessed. with hard coral cover declining in many regions. And in some regions, it's looking rather worse than in the Pacific, as we've just seen from Serge's slides. And the key pressures, as Serge also mentioned, are continuing to increase. So what did ICRI do about this? In 2018, as Margaret mentioned at the beginning, there was a kickoff to see what should be done. And ICRI undertook an assessment of HE Target 10 and tried to understand the experiences of coral reef countries in implementing this target. And as a result of that, and some of the lessons learnt, it was felt that it was really important that ICRI remains engaged in the post-2020 consultative processes to make sure that coral reefs would feature in the next iteration of the strategy. They set up an ad hoc committee, which was a very active group of countries and organizations. And they were given 3 terms of reference, a mandate given by ICRI to firstly engage in the CBD's process, and secondly, to draft a recommendation of how coral reefs could be prioritized in this new framework, and thirdly, to communicate the recommendation. So the work of the ICRI members, and these are the countries that are shown on the screen, the recommendation, which was the result of terms of reference number 2, was concluded in May 2020, representing 18 months of consultative work and a lot of discussion between organizations, scientists, and governments. And the result represents a consensus of all ICRI members, including the 44 countries and the custodians of 3/4 of the world's coral reefs. It's important to emphasize that the process to draft and adopt the recommendation was highly collaborative, and there are many countries that have been critical in helping to shape this recommendation in order that something useful could be produced to help countries in negotiating this new framework. Much of the preparatory work has been submitted to the CBD process in response to the various consultations, and is also available on the ICRI website. There are 3 elements to the recommendation. The first element is about the text of the Global Biodiversity Framework, and it's really calling for prominent recognition of coral reef ecosystems within the text of the framework, both in the goals and the targets, ensuring that these are considered at ecosystem scales with a focus on enhancing integrity and resilience so that these ecosystems are able to support human society in the future. The second element is about timing and ensuring that the goals and targets have timescales that are appropriate for achieving the stabilization and recovery of coral reef ecosystems, recognizing the lag times between action and effect, and these cycles also of recovery that take time to happen. And the third calls for inclusion of a set of actionable, measurable, and meaningful coral reef indicators that will be foundational in determining progress against the goals and targets. And the 6 priority recommendations are shown on the screen here. The expectation of all this is the realization that these elements will increase the visibility, focus, and prioritization of coral reefs, this special ecosystem at a really critical juncture. It will also help to increase capacity to assess coral reefs globally and increase accessibility and coherence of information and knowledge. The slide here, which I've kindly borrowed from colleagues at WCS, shows us the current version or current framework that is being discussed under the CBD, and helps me to just show you where these indicators can contribute and feed into the framework. So the healthy coral reef indicators that are recommended by ICRI, firstly, can help feed into and support measure Goal A, where information about coral reef extent and live coral cover can work together to provide information on changes of extent in the coral reef ecosystems. In addition, if you can add information on the cover of fleshy algae and other benthic organisms and fish abundance and biomass, then we can start building up a picture to understand ecosystem function and integrity. Something that's also relevant to target 1, and particularly target 1.2, which looks at fragmentation of natural areas. Then looking at target 2, you can see that the tracking of percentage of coral reefs that are protected is something that's a very achievable metric and can help show ecological representativity. Target 6 shows water quality. Target 6 is focusing on pollution, and water quality, of course, is incredibly important for healthy coral reefs. The index of coastal eutrophication, which is recommended, is already a sustainable development goal indicator and could provide a highly relevant information for coral reef health. So these are the ideas as it stands at the moment. And of course, those of you who are involved in these negotiations know that it's evolving. Things are changing. Negotiations are still in relatively early stages. And so there may be other opportunities as things evolve. And it's rather a dynamic situation that we keep engaged with. The current pandemic, as we all know, has caused a huge amount of change in how we do business. It's caused delay and uncertainty, but also it's provided opportunity to dig a little deeper into some of these issues, and an opportunity to make sure that we're understanding how these goals and targets can be measured appropriately, and where there is space for special ecosystems and critical ecosystems like coral reefs. And it's really important that we take this opportunity that's been given. So once a recommendation has been adopted, it's important that it is used and has impact. And so we're spending a lot of time talking with colleagues in various government administrations and supporters and those that have been involved in putting this together about how best the recommendation that we've created can have the desired impact in the negotiations. So far, it's principally been used to engage consistently in consultations and also to give coral reefs a coherent voice, developing a narrative that can be shared and amplified across the world. The challenge to realize the end goal is that there's actually no simple action that can be taken. It's not one thing that will change the course of coral reef health and function, but it's multifaceted. Multiple actions are needed across multiple scales by multiple actors, but it is possible and it is critical. So when we're talking about what it is that can be done in terms of the CBD process and negotiations, this could include ensuring that coral reefs are a top negotiating priority for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And also that what is a priority at national level also follows through in the regional scale as well. The other thing that's important is to ensure that ecosystem specificity is retained in the monitoring framework. We've had an increasing number of voices showing their leadership in support of the recommendation and the importance of highlighting coral reef ecosystems in this new framework. And we're sharing these voices through social media platforms and via other communications. We strongly encourage you to add your voice. In addition, something that's important to discuss is what is it that ICRI can continue to provide as a global partnership. And there are two elements to this. That firstly, in the negotiation phase, and then also critically when it comes to implementation once the framework has been adopted. So in the negotiation phase, we can provide technical policy support, produce supporting materials, communication assets, and there are a number of things that we can do. We've been providing a number of webinars and also bilateral consultations. And then in the implementation phase, we talk about mobilization of resources, tools to support monitoring, such as the monitoring and assessment work through the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network, and also long-term engagement by key NGO partners. There's an awful lot of material that's available, and I really invite you to visit our website, where you can find a lot of the material that I've shared, the infographics which translated into a number of languages, and also some of the more technical policy analysis as well. So with that, I just invite you again to pop into our booth. We'd be very happy to answer questions, and we can pop over to the lounge after this session as well. So we look forward to keeping in touch. But for now, I would like to finish my talky bit and hand over to Anne-Claire, who will be able to introduce us to our panelists, and we can have some discussion about what this all means within the Pacific region. So with that, over to you, Anne-Claire.
Merci beaucoup, Émilie. Merci à Serge également et Margaret de nous avoir présenté le contexte à la fois scientifique et politique qui permettent en fait à l'ICRI de faire des propositions concrètes et j'espère efficaces. J'en profite également pour remercier Vulcan, qui a été en fait un des sponsors de la première heure et qui ne nous a jamais lâchés dans l'organisation de la conférence. Je remercie également les organisateurs d'avoir permis à cette conférence, malgré quelques soubresauts, d'être organisée. L'objectif du panel va être donc de contextualiser ces recommandations du Pacifique, ces recommandations de l'ICRI dans le Pacifique, et de définir en fait avec différents responsables des pays et territoires du Pacifique quelles sont les étapes qui ont été reconnues par chacun d'entre eux pour faire en sorte que les recommandations aboutissent à des résultats concrets. Oops. I will just switch to English to present you. Excuse me. I will just present you all the panelists. So the first panelist will be Thierry Cantery. He's just next to me. So since 2018, Thierry has been the head of Maritime Affairs Office of New Caledonia, in charge of maritime safety, training of seafarers, maritime fishing and management of the Coral Reef, Coral Sea Natural Park. Before 2018, he was director of marine natural parks and national parks for the French Agency for Biodiversity. He coordinates 9 marine nature parks, the attachment of 10 national parks, and the creation of regional biodiversity agencies with local authorities.
Anne-Claire, sorry, I'm really sorry to interrupt.
2015, he was the director of the Marine Natural Park of Iroise.
Sorry, Anne-Claire, do you think you could just change your...
I will now present you Catherine. So Catherine Martin, Dr. Catherine Martin is the Assistant Director of International Heritage and Strategic Direction of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority in Australia. So Dr. Martin has worked in a range of diverse areas that include setting the authority's strategic position on key threats, running the major inshore reef monitoring program, working on regional report cards, and coordinating science and research. Dr. Martin's interests include integrating knowledge across multiple disciplines for effective management of natural resources. understanding interactive and cumulative pressures on ecosystem health, and to evidence-based policy to manage for ecosystem resilience. So prior to her position, Catherine was awarded a fellowship at the Smithsonian Institution and also held positions with the Reef and Rainforest Research Center, the Department of Environment Marine Division, and the Japanese government. Hi, Catherine. And
Anne-Claire, can you hear me, Anne-Claire? Sorry to interrupt you. Do you think you could just put your language into English, please, so that it's coming through in the right channel once you change language? Thank you so much.
Yeah. And the last panelist is Kosi Latu. So Mr. Kosi Latu has been the Director General of the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environmental Program, SPREP, since 2016. SPREP was established by a treaty in 1993 to provide environmental technical support to all the Pacific region. Mr. Latu previously served as SPREP Deputy Director General and also worked at the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat and the Commonwealth Secretariat for 11 years in the roles of a special legal advisor and head of the Legal and Economic Division and Deputy Director for the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Division. A graduate of Canterbury University, Mr. Latu's expertise is in international environmental law, law of the sea, and financial compliance. So welcome all my panelists. So I will begin with the first question. The first question will be in French, so I switch to French. Donc la première question va s'adresser au directeur général du PRE, Monsieur Kosi Latu. Kosi, est-ce que vous pourriez nous expliquer pourquoi est-ce que le cadre mondial post-2020 pour la biodiversité est important pour la protection et la conservation des récifs coralliens de la région?
Thank you very much, Anne-Claire, and good morning or good afternoon to you all, wherever you're joining us, and to my fellow panelists, thank you very much for joining us, and also all those participants that are joining through on this side event. Let me just start off by saying that, and I think that Emily and others like Serge have kind of talked about the vision and the focus of the GBF in terms of setting out a vision for 2050 in terms of living in harmony with nature, and it is an aspirational vision, but it's something that aligns very well with what we call the leaders' Blue Pacific narrative or the Blue Pacific vision. And I like to just refer to a specific reference in that Blue Pacific narrative. And this is what it says. The Blue Pacific connects us, feeds communities, drives economies, and is central to the culture of our Pacific family. So in that broad sense of that vision that was coined by our leaders, it actually aligns well with the vision that has been set through the GBF in terms of, 2050 timeline. Now, notwithstanding that, we do know that currently, in terms of the science that we know of, we know that there's enormous pressure, not just broadly on the oceans and our coastal marine ecosystems, but specifically for coral reefs, we know that there's an enormous pressure. And mainly, these pressures are mainly coming from us as human beings, whether it be climate change, whether it be pollution, whether it be agricultural or industrial runoff. We are the ones that are the major threats to ourselves in terms of our own human interventions. And, needless to say, that coral reefs, the importance of coral reefs to the Pacific is something that I think all of us are aware of. It underpins our livelihoods, our culture, generating income in terms of tourism. It provides a strong buffer in terms of, storm surges, cyclones, and so forth. So the importance of coral reefs cannot be underestimated. We talk about climate change as being an existential issue, but I want to say that the impacts that we're seeing on coral reefs and the threats that are continuing to result in the decline of some of our coral reef systems, in my view, amounts to an existential threat. Yesterday and the day before, we heard many of our speakers talk on many aspects of biodiversity, and a lot of them referred to as the loss of biodiversity as an existential issue. So it's not just climate change. We need to be looking at that whole issue of coral reefs as being part of that broader issues that are in fact threatening our livelihoods. And so, of course, coral reefs, as far as I'm concerned, are some of the most vulnerable ecosystems, not just in the planet, but for us in the Pacific, for the reasons that I've already indicated. I think that the targets within the framework itself and the associated indicators map out a good way to achieve progress. But of course, it's very, very important that these global targets are translated and implemented at the regional and national level. It's what happens at the national level that is so important. And this means providing the necessary resources. We talked about, and it's mentioned earlier on by, I think, Emily, the need for capacity to enable us to monitor, review, and assess the true status of our coral reefs is so important in the region. And this was one of the reasons why I think, as Emily pointed out in her presentation, that we weren't able to achieve the ICRI target number 10 because we weren't able to measure. And so having targets, measurable indicators that we can assess and measure is so important in terms of our response to preserving our coral reefs. And I think that this aligns really well with the ICRI recommendation. We need to support that. Let me come to perhaps my last point, and that is the Pacific Coral Reef Action Plan, which is being finalized at the moment. And it's being finalized in consultation with member countries, with our scientific community, our non-state actors. And so there's excellent input that's going into that Pacific Coral Reef Action Plan. But it identifies many of the stresses that some of you have mentioned already. It looks at what's happening at the national level with the country programs and what they're doing. And it identifies some of the actions that's needed to meaningfully address coral reefs at the regional level. The plan seeks to be implemented over the next decade, next 10 years. At this point, the plan does not have indicators, but this will be included as we progress the finalization of the action plan. There are threats that are identified in the action plan itself, which are prioritized and aligned well with the indicators. And so that work is progressive. We're looking to integrate those priorities and indicators as we finalize the Pacific Coral Reef Action Plan. So I guess I just want to finish up by saying that the indicators proposed by ICRI will provide, I think, an excellent monitoring framework that will support Pacific Island countries not only to monitor the health of the coral reef systems, but also to focus in terms of effective investment in terms of conservation and restoration. I'll stop there because I think I've come to the end of my time. Thank you very much. Can't hear you, Anne-Claire. Can you unmute yourself?
You're muted.
Pardon. Merci beaucoup, Kossi, pour avoir mis en évidence que la conservation des récifs est dans le Pacifique une question existentielle, avec une mise en œuvre au niveau local, national, régional, Vous avez souligné l'importance des indicateurs qui permet effectivement à tous les acteurs de la conservation d'avoir un cap et d'avoir des jalons dans le suivi de l'atteinte des objectifs. Vous avez souligné la mise en œuvre des organisations régionales dans la mise en place de ce plan d'action sur 10 ans, qui est un temps long qui permet effectivement de mesurer les impacts positifs ou négatifs. Je vois également que vous avez vraiment mis en évidence l'importance de la coopération entre les organisations telles que l'ICRI, les organisations régionales et les pays et territoires du Pacifique. Et je vais donc me tourner maintenant vers nos deux autres panélistes pour leur poser la question suivante. Le PROE, l'Australie et la Nouvelle-Calédonie ont été particulièrement impliqués dans la préparation et dans l'adoption de la recommandation de l'ICRI pour faire que les récifs coralliens deviennent une priorité du cadre post-2020. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous dire pourquoi vous estimez qu'il est important d'avoir adopté cette recommandation et surtout, comment est-ce que vous l'avez utilisée dans votre contexte? Je vais peut-être commencer par donner la parole à Catherine, puis ensuite je donnerai la parole à Thierry et nous terminerons par Kossi. Merci beaucoup.
Oh, hello, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak today, and thank you for the panelists. I think Kossi covered a lot of what was really important about developing the recommendation, and certainly from our perspective, we worked hard to get that in place because we thought it was extremely important for ICRI to have a consistent and coherent voice when advocating for the protection and conservation of coral reefs, particularly at the global forum level. And, you know, the recommendation also provides a mechanism through which we can all work together to influence the global targets and actions and try to stabilise coral reefs and protect their functional integrity. And then, of course, the act of developing that really built the momentum that was necessary to try to come together and really develop meaningful actions and targets in the Global Biodiversity Framework. So, and it's really through that inclusion of the specific indicators that we're able to provide a way to consolidate information to get an accurate picture of what's going on at coral reefs at very different temporal and spatial scales and in different areas of the Pacific. So yeah, that's really some of the most critical parts of the recommendation from our perspective. And I just was wondering, because the translation kind of dropped off at the end, did it ask was the end bit about how we'd incorporated that recommendation? I couldn't quite catch that. Was that the question?
Excuse me, Catherine, can you please repeat, because it was not very clear, the last sentence you said. Thank you.
Yeah, similarly, the end of the question wasn't very clear. Were you asking how the recommendation was incorporated? I didn't quite catch that.
No, it will be the next question. So this is the end for you.
Sorry.
And I will ask now Thierry to answer to this question. Thank you very much, Catherine.
Bonjour à tous, donc je vais parler en français. Il est très important pour la conduite des politiques publiques d'avoir ce genre de cadre structuré, spécifiquement pour les récifs coralliens. Pourquoi? Parce que quand on veut faire évoluer les décisions politiques, faire changer la façon de travailler des leaders, on a besoin d'éléments forts et assez clair. Je prends un exemple, le changement climatique, la déforestation, tous les citoyens se rendent compte des choses. Quand on parle de la dégradation ou de la perte de biodiversité d'un récif corallien, eh bien, pas beaucoup de personnes sont au courant, pas beaucoup de personnes peuvent le voir et le comprendre. Et donc, on a extrêmement besoin d'indicateurs comparés entre les territoires du Pacifique, de façon à pouvoir détecter cette évolution, parce que le changement climatique, par exemple, n'aura pas les mêmes impacts en Calédonie ou en Polynésie. Donc, on a besoin de ces indicateurs pour avoir un discours structuré à l'échelle du Pacifique et qui s'assoit sur des données scientifiques fiables et incontestables pour être ensuite traduites clairement pour faire évoluer la décision. Et donc, ce cadre post-2020 de l'ICRI nous sera très utile, nous qui conduisons des politiques de protection de la biodiversité, parce qu'on pourra traduire en langage clair et en langage incontestable des évolutions de biodiversité qui sont identifiées par les scientifiques et qu'on a parfois du mal à traduire dans quelque chose de compréhensible et d'acceptable, d'appropriable par les décideurs.
Merci beaucoup Thierry pour ce point de vue. Je vais maintenant me tourner vers Kossi. Vous avez déjà abordé effectivement l'importance en fait de l'utilisation d'indicateurs dans le plan d'action sur les récifs coralliens dans le Pacifique. Est-ce que vous pourriez nous apporter un complément de réponse de la part du PROE?
Sorry, Anne-Claire, can you just repeat the question?
You're just muted, Anne-Claire.
Yeah, excuse me, I will switch to English. So SPREP, Australia and New Caledonia have been very engaged in the work to develop and adopt the ICRI recommendation for prioritizing coral reef in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Could you tell us why you felt it was important to develop the recommendation and how you have used it in your own context?
Yeah, well, thank you, Anne-Claire, for that follow-up question. I think that we all agree that what's been recommended in the ICRI recommendation is so critical as we move forward towards the post-2020 framework on biodiversity. And there are a number of key meetings that are coming up. For example, the Substar 24 meeting that's coming up early next year. We need to make sure that what we convey at these discussions align well with what is in the ICRI recommendation. You know, whether it be the Substar negotiations or, for example, even the PB&J, you know, there has to be an alignment of the messages that we are developing at this point. It needs to be coherent and it needs to be consistent. And that's why it's so important to have the ICRI recommendation as a basis for us moving forward. And we need to ensure that those messages are coherent and consistent at the national level and also at the regional level. And we need to then take those messages and make sure that our voice is heard at the global platforms that some of which I've just mentioned. So, and I think that from that perspective, it is so critical for us then to make sure that what we're talking about today, for example, it remains coherent and conveyed in a way that's clear for our leaders, for example, because, you know, our leaders are the ones that are the voice of the region. And so when they go to these important global platforms and global negotiations, it is the same message that is being conveyed. And I think that's, I mean, there's a couple of other things I could say, but I think that for us, you know, we need to make sure that those messages are clear and those messages are coherent as we convey them to the international forum. But, you know, as I said, you know, the references to the indicators and the need for us to have those as part of, you know, the post-2020 framework discussions is critical, because we know that from the IG targets, we haven't done well. So we need to do something, have something in place to ensure that we do better this time. And so that would be my view. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Kossi, pour cette explication. Je trouve particulièrement intéressant de voir qu'il y a une cohérence entre les scientifiques, les gestionnaires et les organisations régionales et puis un point de vue commun qui est le fait de s'appuyer sur des données scientifiques qui sont à la fois reconnues et sur le long terme. Cette recherche de cohérence et cette recherche de légitimité des chiffres qui permettent en fait d'appuyer la décision politique est vraiment importante. Et donc, je vous remercie pour votre réponse. I will switch to English for the next question. The next question is for Catherine. So, Catherine, as you know, ICRI have recommended the inclusion of 6 coral reef indicators within the CBD post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Perhaps you can provide some deeper reflection from the Australian perspective on the role of indicators in informing management and policy. Thank you.
Oh, sure. Thanks for the interesting question. So yeah, indicators, when they're incorporated in an effective monitoring program, are a critical part of the adaptive management cycle. So it's really through these indicators, as been said already, that you're able to track progress towards goals and targets in any management plans that are aimed at protecting and conserving coral reefs. So they're really, really critical. And yeah, in order to manage any ecosystem or a particular site, you need to understand it. So indicators can tell you about the condition of trend of that ecosystem. It can tell you about the functional integrity. And also importantly, it tells you about the ability of that ecosystem to resist or recover from any impact. So its resilience. So when you have that system level understanding, you're then able to target your management actions effectively to mitigate any key pressures or threats that are affecting that site. You can also focus on particular areas to build reef resilience. So for example, through spatial planning, can happen at different scales. And yeah, so from our perspective in the Great Barrier Reef, we're very fortunate to have several well-funded monitoring programs that already incorporate many of the indicators that are part of that recommendation. But importantly, these monitoring programs, they have evolved in an ad hoc way. So while they might be monitoring the same indicator, they could be doing so at different spatial or temporal scales, and perhaps even using different methods. So that can make it very challenging when you're trying to integrate all of this information to get a picture of what's going on at the level of the Great Barrier Reef. So going forward and implementing these indicators, it's really important to consider like how this information can be integrated and shared across the region, and especially through networks such as ICRI's Global Reef Monitoring Network. And just another example, so one of our most well-established programs that's been going for at least 15 years is looking at the impact of water quality on the health and resilience of coral reefs. And this program is made up of several small programs that monitor water quality from the land, so from the farm level all the way out to the reef. And over time, they've worked to develop consistent methods and things. So through this program, we're able to get a really good picture of what's going on and understand where the hotspots are and what high risks are. And then we're able to target our management actions effectively to address those risks. And then ultimately through the adaptive management cycle, this feeds into improving our management plans. And that's broken down to regional levels too, which is a point that's been made already. It's important to consider these different scales. So just to sum up, I think it's, given that it's such a critical time for coral reefs worldwide, this really is a great opportunity for us to develop a robust monitoring framework that includes a common suite of indicators that will help to protect and conserve the functional integrity of coral reefs in the Pacific and also worldwide. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Catherine, pour cette explication très précise. Effectivement, Je pense que l'importance du suivi de la résilience des récifs coralliens dans le Pacifique est cruciale. À la fois, les indicateurs permettent, comme vous l'avez dit, de comparer, mais de suivre. Et je pense qu'aussi, ça permet quelque part d'être redevable vis-à-vis des citoyens, c'est-à-dire de montrer l'efficacité ou la non-efficacité de l'action politique. Je vais poser ma prochaine question à Thierry et ensuite je prendrai une des questions qui a été posée par un des participants au side event. Donc Thierry, l'un des indicateurs proposés consiste à mesurer le pourcentage de récifs coralliens qui sont gérés efficacement. En tant que gestionnaire du parc naturel de la mer de Corail, pourriez-vous nous dire dans quelle mesure cela est réalisable et en termes de mise en œuvre, et y a-t-il des défis particuliers de mise en œuvre pour cette région qui doivent être absolument pris en compte? Je vous remercie.
Merci. Donc, pour ce qui concerne la protection des récifs coralliens, on peut déjà indiquer que pour la France, l'engagement fort qui a été pris, c'est de protéger 100% des récifs coralliens à l'échelle 2025, ce qui veut dire qu'on est vraiment très proche de l'échéance avec une ambition très, très élevée. Donc, les difficultés particulières pour protéger des récifs coralliens sont de plusieurs ordres. Tout d'abord, la première étape, c'est de mettre un cadre réglementaire sur le récif corallien, sur l'espace géographique du récif, c'est-à-dire création d'une réserve, interdiction de pêche, interdiction de travaux, tout ce qu'on peut imaginer, donc du grade le plus simple au plus élevé. Donc ce cadre réglementaire permet de limiter les dégradations identifiées du récif. Ensuite, donc, pour ce qui concerne la Nouvelle-Calédonie, par exemple, les récifs coralliens éloignés, donc sur les îles assez loin de la Grande Terre de Nouvelle-Calédonie, sont sous statut de protection élevée, donc la première étape est franchie. Ensuite, il y a une deuxième étape qui est de mettre en place un suivi scientifique pour comprendre la qualité du récif corallien, sa bonne santé, donc c'est ce qu'on appelle les indicateurs. Donc, il y en a plusieurs ordres, ils sont tous identifiés dans les recommandations de l'ICRI, donc c'est très bien, donc ça il faut ensuite le mettre en place. Ça c'est plus compliqué à mettre en place parce que forcément ça a un certain coût, et puis pour ce qui concerne la Nouvelle-Calédonie, ce sont des récifs qui sont à plusieurs jours de mer, ce qui veut dire qu'on ne peut pas mettre un suivi quotidien simple, il faut des moyens, des navires, des scientifiques, et on n'a pas ça forcément sous la main assez facilement. Donc on est obligé de composer, de faire des choix, de faire ce qu'on appelle des stations, de ne suivre qu'un petit espace du récif et d'extrapoler, etc. Enfin, tout ça, c'est bien calibré scientifiquement. Et la troisième étape pour garantir la protection, c'est la surveillance, c'est-à-dire de garantir que les réglementations sont respectées. Ce qui veut dire qu'il ne faut pas qu'il y ait de la surpêche, qu'il ne faut pas qu'il y ait de la plaisance, qu'il y ait des débarquements, qu'il y ait des bateaux de croisière, etc. Et donc, ça nécessite de mettre en place un système de surveillance qui soit très opérationnel. Et donc ça, c'est pareil, c'est techniquement compliqué et coûteux, parce que quand on parle de récifs qui sont à plusieurs jours de mer, à plusieurs centaines de kilomètres, eh bien, la technologie n'est pas parfaitement adaptée. Les moyens existent, mais sont très coûteux. On ne peut pas envoyer un avion tous les jours sur l'espace. Donc, vous voyez qu'on a des vrais défis pour garantir que les réglementations, que l'ambition post-2020 se traduisent dans les faits, parce que, comme le disait Anne-Claire, on a aussi des comptes à rendre à nos élus, mais aussi aux citoyens. Et donc ça, c'est notre travail d'opérateur technique, de mettre tout ça en place. Et donc les défis et la complexité est immense.
Merci beaucoup Thierry pour cette explication. Donc, ce qui est important effectivement, c'est que l'impulsion, elle est d'abord sur l'ambition politique affichée. Ensuite, la création du cadre juridique permet effectivement d'asseoir à la fois les plans de gestion, les mesures de suivi, les mesures de surveillance. Mais comme l'a rappelé Thierry, effectivement, le suivi et la surveillance sont des activités extrêmement coûteuses et qui ne sont efficaces que si elles sont programmées sur le long terme. Ce qui me permet en fait de faire le lien avec une question qui nous vient d'une personne qui nous écoute en ce moment. Donc la question posée est la suivante: comment se fait-il que nous ayons autant de mal à faire financer les programmes de suivi alors que alors qu'il a été prouvé tel que tous aujourd'hui, vous l'avez dit autour de la table, qu'il était important d'obtenir des données chiffrées, fiables sur le long terme pour guider les politiques publiques. Je vais peut-être donner la parole à Serge, dont c'est le travail tous les jours d'essayer de trouver des sous pour financer ces suivis scientifiques. Et ensuite, si quelqu'un d'autre veut prendre la parole, ce sera avec plaisir. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Anne-Claire. And I will speak slower for the interpreters than the first time. The main difficulty, first of all, I would like to change maybe what we call suivi scientifique that are for me more observatory. And then there's no real science in that aspect, except if we want to develop new proxy, new methodology. But in terms of monitoring itself, in terms of following what's happening, it's not scientifically what is science. It's actually the way we're going to interpret that. But the collection itself, it's not science. And I think it's important because often we are making those two words and that confuse. And to me, one of the main problems for funding is actually to have the long-term funding, because rarely any kind of government will engage yourself into, I would say, into a long-term funding. You will have funding that will be on the baseline of 3 years, maybe 5 years. It is almost impossible to go further than that, because most of the programs, funding programs that are available at the government level are not over those type of timing. The other things that makes the funding complicated, it's maybe because we should have the idea of those monitoring not in the term of scientific monitoring, but in the way of observatories, and making those observatories as compulsory for countries. And then if we were able to design that sort of frame, then it's not anymore a scientific aspect. It's really something that is actually dedicated to nations to be able to provide, and then to give the nation actually their obligation to provide those data. And making this way, it's not anymore something that we will have to look for funding. So I think maybe one way to disconnect to ensure actually a longer term funding, it's actually to have that into an observatory sort of aspect more than a scientific aspect, and maybe disconnect that from science, even if you can have people scientific involved in the project, not anymore calling that scientific. That's my vision anyway.
Anne-Claire, can I just make a time check reminder? So we've come pretty much to or a little over time. So perhaps we can take some very last comments and have a wrap up and take home message from Kosi. I think you're on mute still, Anne-Claire.
Oh, thank you very much, Emily. So thank you for this reminder. I think also that some panelists have to leave. So if we can also, yes, if we can just perhaps end our panel session. So I'm very happy to have been the moderator of this discussion, very interesting one. And I will let Kosi perhaps wrap up for this very nice discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anne-Claire, and thank you very much, everybody. Can I start off by picking up on where Serge left? Because I think that's a very important point that he made about monitoring. And you know, our experience, unfortunately, when it comes to government funding, governments, from a political perspective, prefer to see action. They prefer to see implementation rather than putting money into monitoring. Something that takes a long time, and it's, you know, you understand that these are politicians and they're not going to be around for 10 years. Sometimes they're going to want to see something meet. Unfortunately, that is the reality, that, and I've seen that happen. But we had to then look at other ways is it not possible for us to maybe perhaps look at funding from some of these philanthropic entities, some of these NGOs, big NGOs that are focused on oceans and so forth. Ocean 5 is one example. There are many others. So perhaps maybe we should be rethinking our approach in terms of securing funding from other sources, given the difficulty that Serge mentioned about governments, because their budgets are not for 10 years or beyond. They're very short term, and it's for mainly political reasons, and that's a given point. Let me then just move on. I think that what's very clear from what has been said this morning is that we need to work together with the ICRI recommendation. This is our path towards our contribution to the global framework. And it's very important that we work together. And I mentioned earlier on that we need to be coherent and consistent in terms of our messages. We will be reaching out to the leaders. Unfortunately, the leaders meeting this year is only focused on two issues. First is the appointment of the new Secretary General, and secondly, COVID-19, and nothing else is on the agenda. So it's very difficult for us. We need to find other ways to try and convince the leaders that this is such an important issue. So that's one avenue for us as we move forward. We appreciate, I think it's very obvious that the work of ICRI is important for the Pacific in terms of the negotiations. We need that support. And I mentioned that there's that SABSTA 24 session coming up early next year where we will need that support from ICRI. And then, of course, the implementation that's been mentioned in Emily's presentation. The countries definitely need that support. And we need our leaders to consistently advocate as the voice of the Pacific in terms of coral reefs. It's interesting to see that the outcomes of the poll, in the questions, what is the main threat to coral reefs? And I think, I just had a quick glimpse, and 60% said climate change, and that is probably true. But we also need to look at the whole gamut of things. Climate change is the most pressing issue, but we also need to look at the other interventions that we as human beings are involved in. Everything that we mentioned about pollution, agricultural, industrial runoff, invasive species, all of these things, they don't emanate from the atmosphere, they emanate from us. So we are our worst enemy when it comes to protecting the very thing that we are advocating for. So, but just on that climate change issue, we know the science is very clear. The IPCC 1.5 degrees report is very clear. At 1.5, 70 to 90% of the coral reef will decline. That's what the scientists and unfortunately, the water surface temperature in terms of the oceans is increasing. It's not decreasing. It's increasing. And once it gets to 2 degrees, according to that report, we are going to see 99%, up to 99% of our coral reefs disappear. Now, that's a terrible picture for us to deal with, but that's the reality. And that's why we keep saying that coral reefs is an existential issue. Climate change cannot be seen as being separate from coral reefs, because there is those linkages, and we need to look at it from the interlinkages and connection in terms of how coral reefs is impacted by not just by human beings, but in terms of how we look at it as one ecosystem. That's how we should be looking at it, as one unit rather than just there's much more I could say, but let me just say this, that we definitely prioritize coral reefs moving forward into the post-2020 global framework discussions. We shouldn't be looking at coral reefs in isolation. We should be looking at it as part of a continuum of ecosystems. And we are doing some things in the region, like Ridge to Reef. We need to align with those things. These are things we're already doing. We need to look at some of the coastal wetlands work that we're doing, and so forth. And so the holistic approach is definitely something that I would be advocating in terms of our approach here in the region. And then we must deal with all of these other sectoral issues, coastal fisheries, reduction of pollution, plastics and so forth. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But let's try and progress the ICRI recommendation in the path that's been suggested from SPREP. I can say that we will be working with leaders to try and be the voice that that can be for us in terms of this very, very important issue. So let me conclude by saying that the Global Biodiversity Framework definitely offers enormous opportunity for us to undertake some of the actions that I mentioned. And yes, it's not just one thing. It's looking at a whole range of measures that we need to do. And we at the Pacific, we stand to benefit from the input and the technical advice from ICRI and our scientists around the region. And so we want to acknowledge the work of ICRI and the collaboration that's happening at that level. And we want to thank you, all of the scientists in the region who are doing enormous and great work in terms of this very important issue. So I conclude by, of course, thank you all, and thank you the organizers, thank you to the ICRI Secretariat, and Vulcan, of course, for sponsoring this very important side event. And I hope that we can take this forward as we look forward to the post-2020 framework and the work that needs to be done prior to that. So from SPREP, thank you to all the participants, the panelists, to our ICRI colleagues, and Unclair, thank you for facilitating this. And it's been a really excellent, fabulous side event. Thank you.